The butler heard it, and so did she, standing on the other side. 3 weeks, the Duke said. His butler wrote nothing down. She began counting stairs, chimneys, bottles, and the men who lied. When the cousin came with papers, she set down the ledgers. 3 weeks. She won't last 3 weeks, Hollis. Write the advertisement now and save us the trouble. That's the sentence, delivered in the flat, pleasant, unbothered tone of a man ordering more coal. Margaret Ainsworth stood on the cold side of that door with her hand flat on the frame, and she did not move. Not a flinch, not a breath out of rhythm. Her thumb found the brass corner of the memorandum book hanging at her waist on its black cord, ink-stained, worn smooth, and she pressed it once, the way some people touch a rosary. Then she turned her cuffs back to the elbow, white linen folded twice, and waited to be called in. The corridor at Halloween in February is a genuine experience. Stone underfoot, no carpet since the old Duchess died, and a draft that comes down the east flight like it's paying rent. 2 fine strands of dark chestnut hair had already escaped at her left temple, the way they always did within an hour of pinning. She left them. Here's what put her there. The late Duchess of Halloween, dead 11 weeks, buried in ground so hard they'd needed pickaxes, had written a codicil in her own hand, witnessed by 2 of her physicians, installing Margaret Ainsworth as housekeeper of Halloween Hall with a salary of £62 a year and full authority over the household keys. Not a suggestion, an instruction, with legal teeth in it. Edmund, Duke of Halloween, had objected, formally, in writing, through the family solicitor, and lost, because his mother had known precisely how her son argued and had built the thing to survive him. So he gave her 3 weeks instead, cheaper than a lawsuit. Mr. Hollis received her in the servants' hall at 3:15, and if you have never been welcomed by a 63-year-old butler who has decided you are a clerical error, allow me to explain the temperature. He was perfectly correct. Heels together, hands at his sides, black tailcoat brushed, the black leather key wallet buttoned at his breast. Buttoned, note, and not offered. He said, "Mrs. Ainsworth," the way other men say, "unfortunately." He listed her duties. He did not sit. He did not invite her to sit. He mentioned, in passing, that Halloween had been run by persons of long service, and no one had ever previously required a codicil to obtain a position here. Behind him, 11 servants studied the flagstones with tremendous interest. The kitchen maid did not look up. The under-footman found something enormously absorbing in the leg of a bench. Cook wiped a clean pan. Ranks closed so fast you could hear them click. Margaret said, "Thank you, Mr. Hollis." 2 words, and she meant them, and that unsettled him more than shouting would have. Now, the house. Halloween has 104 rooms, of which 41 were shut, and 29 had chimneys that had not been swept since the spring before the Duchess took to her bed. The east morning room gets the sun at 7:30 and holds it till 10, which is exactly when nobody uses it. The library fire is always too hot. Some fault in the flue nobody had bothered to name, so the room sat at a steady, scorching bake while the corridor outside froze, which is a very expensive way to be uncomfortable. The rose walk on the south side had gone to brambles and canker in 3 seasons of neglect, 42 bushes and maybe 9 of them still worth the ground. And the 4th stair on the east flight creaked. Not the 3rd, not the 5th, the 4th under the left foot, a dry, complaining sound like a door being opened somewhere else in the house. Margaret noticed it the first evening. She went up and down it 4 times to be sure. Her room was the housekeeper's room off the still-room passage, and in it, on the shelf, left exactly where its owner had put it down, was a receipt book bound in cracked calf. Mrs. Pruitt, housekeeper to the Duchess for 31 years, dead of a fever 6 weeks before her mistress, which is why the codicil existed at all. Margaret had never met her. She knew her handwriting within an hour. Quantities of beeswax, which chimneys drew and which sulked in an east wind. A note that the second-best linen wore through at the hem because the laundry maid folded it wrong, and a diagram of the correct fold. vinegar and warm milk for candle grease in wool, and on the inside board, in a firm, upright hand, "A house tells the truth to whoever bothers to listen." The last page stopped mid-sentence. Mrs. Pruitt had been counting the plate and got as far as 16 desserts. That same week, the family solicitor came down from London with a red seal and an easy way out. There was a widow in Bath, elderly, mild, 7 rooms, 2 servants, no ducal codicils, no butler with a buttoned key wallet, £90 a year. He laid it on the table like a mercy. Margaret folded her hands low, said the position at Hallowdene was hers, and thanked him for the trouble of the journey. He looked at her the way men look at a woman refusing free money. He did not understand. He was not required to. Then she started counting. Rooms first. Every one of the 104, shut and open, doors and windows tried. Chimneys next, 29 of them cold and dirty, and every one written down by Flue and draft. Linen, 986 pieces in the presses, of which 231 were past mending and had been counted as sound for 4 years running. Keys, Mr. Hollis held 48. The Duchess's chart listed 63. 15 keys gone. Nobody offered to help. Nobody spoke to her at supper. Somebody moved the still room ladder. She worked anyway, sleeves turned back, boots quiet on stone, upright and unhurried. And at 11 that first night she sat down at the table in her cold room, opened the brass-bound book on its black cord, dipped the pen, and wrote the first line. 4th stair, east flight, creaks under the left foot. The second line goes in before the candles burned an inch. Blue bedroom chimney, draws poorly in a north wind. The third, north passage, damp along the skirting, worse after rain, worse still after frost. By the end of that first fortnight, she's at line 91, and line 91 reads, coal, 1900 weight burned last week, 14 the week prior, no explanation offered. That's the thing about Margaret Ainsworth. She doesn't argue. She counts. A great house is a machine, and nobody at Hallowdene had bothered to learn how it ran. 41 hearths. 9 of them lit daily whether anyone sat by them or not, because that was the habit, and habits at Hallowdene had the force of law. The library fire always too hot, banked high at 6 and roaring by 9, so that the Duke's own books curled at the spine. The morning room taking east light and no heat at all, because the Flue there shared a stack with the disused chapel and pulled the warmth sideways into cold stone. She walked it all with the brass-bound book on its black cord bumping her hip, sleeves of that plain slate-gray gown turned back to the elbow, white linen cuffs folded neat, and she wrote down which chimney drew, which one smoked, which one had been swept in March, and which one had last seen a brush when the old king was alive. Then she got it wrong. She ordered the sweep to the second flue on the west stack, reasoning from the roof line. It was the third. Within 4 minutes, the blue bedroom was full of soot, a slow black bloom rolling out across a cream carpet that had cost, according to the household book, £62 and some odd shillings. Oh, the staff enjoyed that. Enjoyed it the way people enjoy watching someone above them fall down a stair. There was laughing in the servants' hall that night, loud enough to carry, and one of the footmen did an impression of her standing in the doorway with the smoke pouring past her ears. Nobody helped. Nobody offered. She scrubbed the carpet herself with fuller's earth and cold water, on her knees for 5 hours, and by 2 in the morning the gray had lifted out of it, and she was writing in the book, West stack, 3 flues, not 2. Chapel flue joins at the second course. Confirm from the roof, never from the ground. She never mentioned the mistake to anyone. She simply never made it again. That's the whole method if you want it plain. You get it wrong, you find out precisely why, and the wrongness becomes part of the machine. Silas Carrington heard about the smoke within a day, because Silas heard about everything that made anyone else look small. He came down the corridor with that red Morocco document case tucked under his arm, thumbs hooked in the mustard waistcoat, rocking back on his heels like a man about to bid on a horse. £62 a carpet, he said, smiling. Do you know, I don't believe you'll ever grasp that a house of this size isn't a cottage. You're a servant of a servant, Mrs. Ainsworth. Somebody put a key in your hand by accident and you've mistaken it for cleverness." She wrote down the coal figure while he was still talking. The cellar came next, and the cellar was where the rot showed. 211 steps down and back over 4 days, a lamp in one hand, the memorandum book in the other, and by the end, she had a number that nobody at Halloween wanted to hear. The cellar book said 400 bottles. The bins held 340. 60 bottles gone, quietly, over, she checked the hand, checked the ink, roughly 11 years. Not theft in a lump, theft in a trickle, which is how theft survives. She was on the cellar stair when the Duke found her, and neither of them had planned a single second of it. Lamp on the step above, sleeves pinned back, forearms bare, that dark chestnut coil at her nape holding except for the 2 fine strands at her left temple that never once stayed put. She was counting a bin of hock aloud in a low, even voice, 22, 23, 24, and marking it as she went. Edmund, Duke of Halloween, stood 4 steps up in the dark with one hand behind his back and did not announce himself. He watched her finish the bin, watched her write, watched her tilt the lamp to read a rack label furred with 11 years of dust, and rub it clean with her thumb without any expression at all, because there was nobody important down there to perform for. 60 short, she said, not looking up. It'll be in writing by Friday. 5 words of her own, and the man forgot entirely what he'd come down for. He turned the heavy gold signet on his right little finger with his thumb, said something formal about the hour, and went back up. Then, 20 minutes later, he came down again to ask a question he already knew the answer to. Lady Augusta Vane arrived for the winter on the 14th of November, plum silk and black lace cap, settled into the chair nearest the library fire that was always too hot, and opened the tortoiseshell needlework box on her knee. She said very little for the first week. She simply watched, chin lifted, needle never idle, pale blue eyes tracking her cousin across a room the way a heron tracks a fish. And Hollis, spare and straight, black leather key wallet buttoned at his breast. Hollis's silence began to change temperature. It had been the cold silence of a man waiting for a woman to fail. Around the 3rd week, it became something else. He started leaving the coal returns on her desk before she asked. He stopped correcting her in front of the footman. He corrected her privately instead, which in a butler is nearly affection. Then came the Tuesday. The Duke crossed the yard at 9:30 to speak to the steward. He crossed it again at 11 with a letter that could have gone by a footman. At 1 to look at a gate. At 3:30 he crossed it a 4th time and stood in the cold with one hand behind his back and could not name a single reason he'd have said aloud. 4 crossings of the yard on a Tuesday, and Lady Augusta counting every one. She sat in the morning room where the light came in from the east, the tortoiseshell needlework box open on her knee, and she did not once lift her head to the window. She didn't need to. She could hear his boots on the gravel. 4 times. 1 to ask about the coal returns, 1 to ask whether the second still room had been aired, 1 for no stated reason at all, and 1 to stand in the doorway of the dye shed with one hand behind his back, turning that heavy gold signet with his thumb, watching a woman in a slate-gray gown and turned-back linen cuffs write 4 lines in a brass-bound memorandum book. Lady Augusta drew her thread through and said nothing. She was saving it. Meanwhile, Margaret Ainsworth had found the small noise. That's how it starts, always. Not with a scandal, with a rounding error. The cellar book said the household had drawn 11 dozen of the 19 claret across 3 years. The bin cards, cross-checked against Mrs. Pruitt's old receipt entries in that upright dead hand, said 14 dozen and 5 had left the racks. 60 bottles. Gone. 3 years of a quiet, patient, weekly bleed that no one had ever bothered to add up, because adding up was beneath everyone in that house except the woman they'd hired to carry keys. Small noise. Catastrophic failure. 60 bottles of Halloween claret at £4.10 the bottle is £270. walking out of a locked cellar in a carrier's cart on Thursday afternoons, which is roughly a laborer's wage for 11 years, which is also the exact sum the estate had refused the tenant at Coldbrook when his roof went in. The name attached to it was Barrow, second footman, 9 years in service, a fine calf in a stocking, and an opinion of the new housekeeper he had never once troubled to keep behind his teeth. She'd heard it herself through the pantry door, delivered in that lazy, pleased drawl men use when they think the room agrees with them. She counts spoons because counting's all she's fit for. Some jumped-up steward's daughter with ink on her hands, playing at gentry. She'll be gone by Lady Day and I'll still be here. He was half right about one of those. Here's the part that separates her from every hot-headed fool who ever got themselves dismissed for an accusation they couldn't carry. She didn't say a word for 3 weeks. Not to Mr. Hollis, standing military straight with his black key wallet buttoned at his breast. Not to the Duke. Not to anybody. She verified. She went down into the cellar where the stone holds the cold even in July, and she marked corks. A thumbnail scratch across the wax of every bottle in bins 4 through 9. 142 of them, counted twice, the tally written in the brass-bound book with the date and the hour. She had a dated bin card ruled fresh and initialed each Monday. She noted, without comment, that the carrier's cart came up the back lane on Thursdays at 2:30, and that the second footman was reliably unfindable between 2 and 3. Week 1, 4 bottles short. Week 2, 3. Week 3, 5. And one of her marked corks turned up in the ash heap behind the brew house, scratched exactly where she'd scratched it. That's not suspicion. That's arithmetic with a signature on it. And still, before she moved, there was one night. It rained that Thursday, the hard, slanting kind that comes off the west and finds every gap in a roof. She sat at the kitchen table with a tallow candle and cold tea, sleeves still pinned back. The 2 fine strands escaped at her left temple, stuck damp to her cheek. And she was tired in the way that gets underneath a person, because the letter from Bath was still open, still on the table. A milliner's widow, 40 pounds a year, a clean position in a warm town with no cellars and no carrier's carts, and nobody calling her a jumped-up steward's daughter through a pantry door. Take it, and none of this is your problem. She looked at it a long while. She's allowed to. Then she pulled Mrs. Pruitt's receipt book across the table, the one with the marbled boards and the entry that stops mid-page, and she opened it where it always fell open, and read the line the dead woman had written under a recipe for walnut stain. Waste is only a failure of imagination. Not just cloth, not just food. Waste is 60 bottles going out a back lane while a tenant's roof rots. Waste is a house full of good people trained to look at the floor. She blew out the candle and went to bed, and in the morning she did the thing properly. She handled Barrow without one cruel word. Called him to the still room, alone, no audience, because an audience is how you make an enemy instead of an ending. Laid out the bin cards, the dated tallies, the scratched cork. Told him the carrier's name and the Thursday hours. Then she told him he could go to Mr. Hollis himself and resign his place before dinner, and no charge would be laid, and no letter would follow him beyond the county. He opened his mouth. He looked at the cork. He shut it. He was gone by 3. And the servants' hall that evening was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not friendly, not sorry. Nobody apologized, because nobody in that house ever apologizes in words. But the under-butler stood when she came in, and the cook shifted her chair, and the talking did not start up again behind her back. Grudging silence. It's the second stage, and it's worth more than applause. 2 days later, the Duke found her in the corridor outside the cellar stair and dropped every layer of the formal voice he used on the entire rest of England. "Margaret, tell me what you found." And she looked up at him, level, hands folded low. "I'll need it in writing that no charge follows him." She lays the wine account before the Duke without a single accusation in it and lets the numbers do the speaking. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The library fire was doing what it always did at Halloween, burning too hot, too high, roasting one side of a man while the window behind him leaked November through the sash. The wine account sat on the table between them in her hand, and it was a very quiet document. 41 dozen of claret invoiced in a year the house had held 11 dinners. No accusation, no underlining, just arithmetic, laid out the way you'd lay out a body for the coroner. Edmund turned the signet ring on his little finger once and let it be. What happened over the next 6 weeks happened the way real change always happens, boringly and everywhere at once. The coal bill came down by a fifth because Margaret had the fires in 9 unused rooms stopped and the flues in the ones they kept swept clean enough to draw properly, which meant less coal doing more work. The North Passage, damp for as long as anyone could remember, went dry. Not by magic, by a gutter. One cracked lead gutter above the third window, 40 years of water walking down inside the wall, and a mason's bill of £2.11 to end it. Nobody had looked. That's the whole story of that house in one line. Nobody had ever gone up and looked. The roses got cut back in February, hard, down to 3 eyes on each cane, for the first time since the late Duchess stopped coming out to the garden. The gardeners thought she'd killed them. Her brass-bound memorandum book, ink-stained at the corner, said otherwise, in a dead woman's handwriting. Cut savage in the 2nd month. A plant left kind is a plant left crowded. Then came the part that always comes forth. Not the apology. Nobody in a great house apologizes, but the arrival. The head laundress, a woman who had spent the autumn addressing Margaret's shoulder rather than her face, came to the still-room door on a Tuesday with a scorched cuff in her hand and asked, plainly, how the vinegar rinse worked on the yellowing. Actually asked, with curiosity in it, not a test. Margaret pushed her white linen cuffs back to the elbow, took the fabric and showed her. The acid, the sun, the second rinse, and neither of them said one word about the previous 4 months. The cook went further, which is to say she said nothing at all. She simply began ordering by the week instead of the month, and the waste tub at the kitchen door stopped needing emptying twice a day. That's how a professional says sorry. She changes her practice and dares you to notice. Mr. Fenwick, the steward, noticed. Fenwick had an office in the estate room and a smile he wore the way other men wear a locked gate. Every time Margaret asked for the tenancy rolls, he was delighted, and terribly sorry, and the rolls were with the attorney, or being copied, or somewhere he'd be happy to look on Thursday. There was never a refusal. There was never anything to complain of. And when she pressed, once, standing very still with her hands folded low, he gave her the smile at full strength and said, "It's a great deal of paper for a woman who counts sheets, Mrs. Ainsworth. Let's not have you out of your depth." He meant, "You are staff, and staff have a ceiling, and this is it." She didn't answer him. She wrote the date in the brass-bound book and walked out without hurry, and that is worse than shouting, and Fenwick knew it. By March, she understood why the estate room mattered, because by March, the Duke told her what he had spent his whole life arranging himself around not saying. It came out at the window, one hand behind his back, the way it always came out of him. His mother's debts, £19,400, run up over 11 years and hidden in 3 separate accounts. The entail, which meant he owned everything and could sell nothing. And the understanding with the Pelhams at Marchcourt, 40 miles east, an understanding never signed, never announced, and never once contradicted, because contradicting it would have cost his mother her last comfort and the estate its last credit. He said it in 8 sentences. Then he said her name, without the Mrs., and stopped himself. The ball at Hallowdene was set for the last Thursday in April, and the preparation of it was 3 weeks of physical labor disguised as a social event. 240 candles, dipped and stored cool so they'd burn slow. The long gallery floor scraped, then chalked, French chalk, sifted through muslin, so the soles caught just enough. 900 forced narcissi from the cold frames. The gilt chairs re-webbed, the chandelier lowered on its winch, and every drop washed in vinegar water and dried by hand, because dust on cut glass eats light, and nobody in that room would ever know why the candles seemed brighter than at Marchcourt. She was not meant to dance. She stood at the gallery door in slate-gray wool, with her hair in its tight, low coil, 2 fine strands loose at the left temple, watching the set form. And then the set was short a lady, and a duke crossed a floor he had chalked nothing of, and held out his hand in front of 11 families and Lady Augusta Vane. Their hands met in the turn. Neither one let go on the beat. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than the figure allowed, which in that room was roughly a public confession. Lady Augusta didn't look up from her tortoiseshell box. Her needle never stopped. "He has crossed that floor 4 times tonight," she said to nobody, "and only once for the music." 3 days later, gravel. A hired carriage, badly sprung, coming up the West Drive at a pace that said the man inside believed he owned the ground under the wheels. Silas Carrington stepped down, thumbs already hooked in his mustard waistcoat, a slim red Morocco document case tucked under one arm, and in it, he announced to Mr. Hollis on the step, proof that the settlement of 1812 had never been executed at all. The red Morocco case opened on the long dining table with a click like a pistol being cocked, and Silas Carrington spread his papers across 40 years of beeswax polish as though he'd already bought the wood. Every face in the room turned to the Duke. Hollis at the sideboard, spine locked, key wallet buttoned at his breast. Lady Augusta deep in her chair by the window with the tortoiseshell needlework box open on her knee, needle going, chin lifted. Fenwick, the steward, halfway down the table with his ledgers stacked like a man hiding behind sandbags. And Edmund at the window, one hand behind his back, thumb turning the gold signet on his little finger, slow, once, twice. Carrington didn't wait to be invited to speak. Men like that never do. The claim was elegant on paper. A conveyance dated 1809, the Hallowdene South Holdings, 340 acres, the mill Leet, the whole of Barrow Field, assigned to a Carrington ancestor and never, he said, properly discharged. 40 years of rents drawn on land that wasn't theirs, £14,000 plus the freehold, plus costs. He laid the figure down like a man dealing a winning hand, and then he looked up, and his pale green eyes went past the Duke entirely and landed on the gray-gowned woman standing quiet by the door with her linen cuffs turned back to the elbow. "You may send the housekeeper out," he said. "This is above her." 4 words. Above her. He said them the way you'd flick ash off a sleeve. Margaret Ainsworth did not move. She stood upright and still, hands folded low. The 2 fine strands escaped at her left temple, the brass-bound memorandum book hanging on its black cord at her waist with the ink stain worn into the corner. She had heard worse from better. Edmund said, without turning from the window, that she would stay. So Carrington did what his kind do. He talked over her. He explained the law to the room in the tone of a man explaining a door to a dog. He suggested the Duke settle privately to spare the family name. He mentioned, twice, that estates in decline often have irregular arrangements and no proper records, and he smiled when he said it, thumbs hooked in his mustard waistcoat, rocking back on his heels. Then Edmund asked Fenwick for the counterpart deed. Here's the thing about a house that looks orderly. Fenwick's estate room was a masterpiece of appearance. Ledgers squared, spines flush, the smell of ink and coal smoke and 40 years of nobody checking. Underneath it was chaos. Rent rolls filed by tenant in one decade and by field in the next. 3 separate hands, none indexed. A muniment chest under the window that hadn't been opened since the old Duke's funeral because the key had gone into a drawer and the drawer had gone into a habit. Fenwick came back after 20 minutes with dust on his cuffs and nothing in his hands. He said the counterpart could not be located. He said it might be in London. He said it might, conceivably, no longer exist. Carrington leaned back and let his mouth do a thing that was almost a laugh. Margaret spoke for the first time. "It's in the muniment chest. Second shelf, the japanned box. Third bundle from the left, tied in red tape and mismarked as leases." Nobody in that room moved for a full second. She had catalogued it in November. 9 days of it. Mornings before the fires were laid. The brass-bound book filling up in her small, level hand. Every box, every bundle, every seal, every date, and beside each one a note on the hand it was written in, because a house's papers are written by dead clerks, and you learn their handwriting the way you learn a stair that creaks. She had done it because nobody had asked her to, and because a survey you don't do is a debt you pay later. Fenwick had called it tidying. He'd said the word to her face, in this same corridor, and gone back to his ledgers. Tidying. They brought the chest up. She knelt by it with her gray apron pooling on the boards, went to the second shelf without hunting, and lifted out the japanned box. Third bundle from the left, red tape gone pink with age. Inside, the counterpart deed of 1809, yes, and folded behind it, the thing Carrington had bet 40 years on nobody finding. A settlement dated the 14th of March, 1812, discharging the Carrington interest in full for £800, and clipped to it, sealed, the receipt, signed by his own great-grandfather, witnessed by 2 men whose names were carved in the church wall 400 yards from where he was sitting. She set both on the table in front of him, squared to the edge, and stepped back. £14,000 died on that table without a sound. Carrington's face went through 3 colors. He said something about verification. He said something about counsel. He gathered his papers with hands that had stopped being steady and shoved them into the red Morocco case, and the case wouldn't shut, because it never does when you need it to. And Margaret, this is the part I want you to sit with, did not gloat. Not a word. She waited until the gravel had stopped crunching. Then she knelt back down at the chest, retied the red tape, replaced the bundle third from the left, and asked the Duke whether she might have leave to make a proper index. 211 boxes, cross-referenced by field, by tenant, by year. She said she'd need 6 weeks and a second candle allowance. From the window, over the needlework box, without looking up from her stitch, Lady Augusta said, "He has not looked out of that window once since she knelt down." Then she went back to her needle. That evening, in the corridor outside the still room, the 4th stair creaking somewhere behind them, the cold coming up off the flags, Edmund stopped in front of Hollis and held out his hand. Hollis unbuttoned the black leather key wallet, and the Duke lifted the ring of keys out of his butler's hands and put them into hers. 11 keys. She felt the weight of them settle into her palm, the cellar, the plate room, the muniment room, the still room, the 2 dye sheds, the linen press, the east wing, the gate lodge, the ice house, and the small, worn one for the door at the end of the north corridor that has never closed properly since 1809. Cold iron. Warm from Hollis's hand. Behind her, the whole house had gone quiet in that particular way a house goes quiet when 40 people are listening and pretending to polish something. Margaret Ainsworth did not smile. She folded her hands low, the white linen cuffs turned back to the elbow, the 2 fine strands escaping at her left temple, as they always did by 4 o'clock, and she waited. Edmund stood at the door that would not close, one hand behind his back, thumb working the gold signet on his right little finger, round and round, the way he did when he was about to say a thing he could not take back. And here is where it costs him, because there was an understanding. Not an engagement, nothing so vulgar as paper. An understanding between Hallowdene and the Ferishams, arranged when his mother could still walk the Rose Walk, worth 11,000 acres of adjoining land and the goodwill of half the county. Silas Carrington had been counting on it. Silas, who had stood in this very corridor with his thumbs hooked in his mustard waistcoat and that red Morocco case under his arm, and told the Duke, loud enough for the servant's stare, that the woman is a housekeeper with ink on her hands and delusions above her station. You don't hand a title's keys to something the estate scraped off its own floor. He said that about a woman who had saved his cousin's holdings £4,000 in one winter. Edmund did not answer him then. He answered now at a door with a warped frame to a woman in a slate-gray wool gown. "I have arranged my entire life," he said, "around not saying the true thing. I find I cannot manage another day of it. I want you. Not the work, though God knows I have used the work as an excuse to stand in doorways for 2 years. You. I have written to Farisham releasing the understanding. It is sent. It cannot be recalled." 9 words in that speech cost him the county. She looked at him for a long moment. Gray eyes, level dark brows, the faint pale birthmark below her left ear catching the corridor light. "Then stop standing in doorways," she said. "Come in." 2 people stopped pretending at the same second, and the door still would not close, and neither of them touched it. The collapse of everything arranged against her happened without a single raised voice. Farisham's reply came in 9 days and was 3 lines long and cold as church stone, and that was the end of 11,000 acres. Fenwick, who had spent 4 years explaining, patiently, with a smile, that the estate's interest could not accommodate a woman's hobby, and who had personally ordered 900 bolts of spoiled silk dumped at her gate rather than pay the carting, Fenwick was not dismissed. He was retired. Full pension, a cottage at Ashfold, a letter of thanks in the Duke's own hand, dignity intact and power gone entirely, which is a far worse punishment than shouting, because he had to live in the county and watch her ledgers run the place he used to own. Silas got nothing. Silas kept talking, of course. Nobody listened, which is the only death that man was ever going to notice. And Hollis, 63 years of black tailcoat and heels together and hands at his sides, who had once said she would not last 3 weeks, Hollis did the single most expressive thing of his life. On the morning of the wedding, he unbuttoned the black leather key wallet at his breast, took out the old muniment room key that had been his father's before him, and laid it on the table beside her memorandum book. Said nothing, walked out with his heels together. The wedding was small and in July, and the stone held the cold the way that church always has. 22 people. Lady Augusta Vane sat in the second row in deep plum silk with her tortoiseshell needlework box open on her knee, needle never idle, and afterward, to nobody in particular, delivered the line the whole county would repeat for a decade. He crossed that yard 400 times before he admitted why. "I counted." Then she went back to her hem. Years on now. The rose walk is restored. 340 bushes, the beds recut, the neglected years finally sunk under mulch and manure. The dye sheds run to a schedule pinned inside the door. 412 ledgers stand indexed in the muniment room, in a system nobody but her invented, and the estate clears 11,000 a year on cloth that used to be burned in a pit behind the mill. 29 women in the village work the vats. There is a waiting list, and the Duchess of Hallowdene does not shorten it for titles. She still wears gray wool with the cuffs turned back, still walks without hurry. The brass-bound memorandum book still hangs at her waist on its black cord, ink-stained at the corner. This morning she is in the north corridor with a young woman just come up from the village, hands nervous, apron too new, and she is showing her the door that will not close. Same warped frame, same worn key. "Everything here was thrown out once," Margaret says, easing the door until it catches. "The silk, the ledgers, the woman who wrote them. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is." The girl takes the key. Down the corridor, a tall man in charcoal wool stops in a doorway, one hand behind his back, thumb turning a gold ring, and does not come in, and does not leave. He never has learned to walk past that door, neither has anyone since.